So in this tutorial we're going to look at how to make an ambient atmospheric pad sound out of your kind of garden variety stock sounds that you should have in your DAW. So in this particular example we're going to be using a distorted electric piano, a vibraphone, a regular piano and a glockenspiel. So let's just refresh our memories to what these sort of things might sound like. I've just programmed in a couple of chords here that are stacked across multiple octaves. So there's our distorted electric piano, and here's our vibraphone. Pan slightly off to the left. Our piano. And our glockenspiel. Pan slightly off to the right. So if we have a little look at the sort of frequency analysis of these, we'll see that they're very bright and contain a lot of sort of higher harmonics. So we'll go first with our distorted piano. See lots of high frequency energy there. Similarly with our vibraphone. Those initial transient parts, the parts that sustain are less harmonic. But we've got some nice busy harmonics to start with, and our piano as well. It's got some lovely overtones, and as does this glockenspiel. I have quite a few that sustain for a long time as well, which is going to be handy in this technique. And all we're going to do to create a pad sound out of these is use a very, very long reverb time and have our reverb unit on fully wet and no dry signal. So in this particular instance, we've got a reverb time that lasts 33 seconds. And because the reverb times are so excessive, it's going to kind of smear away all those initial transients, and it's actually going to add a very long attack phase to the sound. So let's just remind ourselves of what the distorted piano sounded like. So relatively quick attack, and then the sound decays a little bit to the sustain portion. We are going to completely change that envelope by using this reverb. So let's have a little listen how this sounds now. So as we can hear, that is very, very different from this without the reverb. And as we go through some of these, it makes it even more noticeable. We're going to just use a different type of reverb now. We're just going to use an algorithmic one that's not based on a impulse response of a real value. This is just all mathematics, and we've daisy chained a couple of them together to create an even longer reverb time. So that's why we have two of them here, and just got the volume as well to take a bit of the volume down because of the sustain of the reverb. So let's have a little listen to our vibraphone now. So that sounds much more like a pad sound now, and much more ethereal than the original vibraphone. Almost to the point there that you can't really necessarily be able to tell that that was a vibraphone to start with. Now on the piano one, we're doing something slightly different. We're going to add some additional processes before we run this through reverb. So we've got a reverb here with 22 seconds worth of reverb time. We have an EQ and a bit crusher. So this is the piano originally. I'll run it through some relatively heavy-handed bit crushing to create some sustain and really bring up the harmonics that are in there and add some in as well from the distortion. So there'll be much broader high frequency content in here that we then nip a bit of it out after with the EQ. But let's have a listen with the piano sample just through the bit crusher. So you can see visually there that those harmonics sustain at a much louder amplitude, and obviously it doesn't sound much like a piano anymore. So we're just going to control and tame some of those in at the top sort of register, at the sort of mid-range, upper mid-range, and just attenuate some of them there. So it makes it slightly less fatiguing overall, and just you can do any sort of EQ processing you like to rein in some of those rather brash harmonics that have been added through the distortions. And finally we'll add in the reverb, again with no dry signal and fully wet, and that will change the attack phase, and because of all those extra sustained harmonics we'll get a very, very interesting sound. We can hear that is very different from the original piano sample. And then finally this glockenspiel. Just get rid of those plugins there. We can have a little listen to our Glock. Just remind us of the tone that's there. And with this one we've rolled off some of those higher frequencies. Some of those very, very bright overtones. We just attenuated them slightly before putting them through, again, a different type of reverb, just to show that this effect can be done with any sort of reverb unit you've got, as long as it's got a wet dry control and can have a sort of significant reverb time. So here we've got a reverb time of essentially 40 seconds. We're going from one reverb unit into the other, and a very, very long time will create a very, very ethereal sounding texture that's very, very different from that source glockenspiel material that we just heard. So you can see there that there's quite a build up of low frequencies as well that we probably can't hear with our equipment, but those will need attenuating and will need sorting out later on. You see, even with those fading away, that sub 20 Hertz is still very, very high in the chain through using those reverbs in such a manner. So let's hear what this sounds like with all of these simple sounds, regular stock sort of acoustic sounds, with all this processing together at the pads bus. We'll hear how all of them layered up work together. So one of the nice things about this technique is because of the layers that you're using, and because of the different amounts of reverb times, etc., from chaining them together or just setting different ones on the units themselves, you actually create multiple attack phases. So you really get a sound that evolves and morphs dynamically over time, and that is very, very different from its original unprocessed version. So let's have a listen to that chord with those sounds without the processing. Doesn't really sound like a pad sound, but by simply using fully wet reverbs we can create something much more powerful like this. Because all of these layers are then sent to a bus, there's no reason why we can't process them further. And the low frequencies that have been incurred in there will need to be nipped out when mixed and used in the context of a full track. So we've added an EQ to get rid of those, and some compression, and then some sidechain compression. And we actually have a filter unit here as well, which I'm just going to use to open and close to introduce the sound to make it even more evolving and dynamic. So we can see there was some simple extra processing as well, like sidechain compression and low pass filtering. We can make the sound even more interesting and even more dynamic. So let's have a listen to this in the context of the type of trance that it might possibly be used in. So just to hear this technique in context, we've added in a little bit of a relatively basic backing track and added in that filter automation to introduce that big atmospheric pad. And this is the sort of technique that you might find in kind of deeper trance, more types of progressive and tribal sort of trance as well, as opposed to your kind of euphoric or electro trance. So there you have it, a very simple but very powerful technique that can be used to turn any sound that has a sort of rich harmonic content into a very, very ambient and atmospheric sound.